this idea of conscious stuff becoming for us and how you gain freedom in that way. And you were also mentioning how it's a double-edged sword. And this reminds me of what Todd McGowan was talking about in
Mm,
Emancipation After Hegel.
mm,
He basically how he understands the dialectic is that contrary to this idea that we're solving contradictions and we're moving towards the absolute, which is this position where you're absolutely free from contradiction. It's just a harmonious totality. It's actually the exact opposite. And it's actually funny that Hegel is probably, I don't know of any other philosopher who has two factions which are maybe equally as large, which literally see him in complete opposite
it's,
ways.
it's pretty extraordinary,
It is
actually.
because,
Yes.
and I don't think we can just say it's because he's unclear. Because in my opinion, like Husserl is just as hard, if not harder, to read than Hegel. So there is really something there that McGowan talks about how it's sort of like we don't want to confront the reality of contradiction, and that's his really his thesis that instead of the dialectic being a progression towards some absolute in the naive sense of the term, the absolute is actually nothing more than you reaching the end of the process because you've recognized that contradiction is intractable, it's universal, and there's no overcoming contradiction. But because we have this ability as free subjects to be conscious and to think through contradiction using reason. And that's why he emphasizes reason over the understanding, unlike
Hmm.
Kant, who emphasized the understanding over reason. Um, because we have reason, we are actually able to reconcile ourselves with contradiction. And that is the absolute. And to me, this sounds a lot like I remember. I believe it was Michelle again who mentioned how
Of course.
you can't solve a garden, but you manage your garden, right? So I think this idea of solving problems, and that is how you end in fascism. That is how you end in really, that's like the purest form of ideology, thinking that you can overcome contradiction in that way. But that doesn't just mean we accept contradiction as if just because when we have a statement of identity like A equals A, just because we can do the speculative turn there, that doesn't mean that A is B. So the solution there is like to reconcile with contradiction. I'm just wondering how do you feel about this idea of reconciling with contradiction, and that, as McGowan says, contradiction is not only inescapable, it's actually the essence of movement, of thought, and of freedom.
Marvelous. That again, I'm telling you, you need to start your business where you frame things and ask questions. Like people are making millions doing consultations, right? It just boom, you frame. All that was magnificent. Hegel is fascinating in the fact that he inspires, the right Hegelians, the left Hegelians, so on and so forth, psychoanalysis. It would be extremely interesting to do a paper or a work that explores why exactly that is, and why Hegel is so unique in breeding all of these different schools. It could be because like I was saying at the beginning, some people take the philosophy of right with a different level of other people might take the phenomenology of space. Well, that's an early Hegel, the later thinker. I mean, there's a lot of moves here. Is the later thinker the more valid thinking than the early thinker? Maybe it's the early. You say, well, Zizek basically says, don't really take too much of the philosophy of history or the right, because that's where he's kind of he's making the universities telling them what they want to hear and so on and so on. So you don't take that. Well, I don't know. Maybe Hegel genuinely wanted to change his mind. This is also why, as just a little note, personally, I one of the things that I think, and I could go down this rabbit hole, has hurt academia a lot is by really investing in the right interpretation. And don't get me wrong, I'm not in the direction of that hard, crazy relativism or whatever. But one of the problems with misreading is that in order to know that you're misreading, you'd have to know the right reading, which if you knew that, you wouldn't be misreading.
Right.
So there's always an inescapable problem. And that's where someone like, I think Harold Bloom, I mentioned him, and even Derrida, because I think Derrida himself was actually quite wise on this, even if following deconstructionists may have been different. There's something about strong misreadings, good misreadings, where it's kind of like, does this meet, is it plausible? Where you start asking that the thinker could mean that. And I think Foucault, in What is an Author, talks about modes of discourse, where you think of these thinkers as a mode of discourse to entertain a certain realm of thinking and so on and so forth. So personally, I think it is important. I think just as a little note for developing one's intellectual journey, I do think it's good to move between the academic debates, to gain from both of them, but to actually make the academic debates not become ego, like your ego and which one do you find your identity in and invest in, because that would actually be falling into the very mistake that Todd is mentioning, because then you're stable. You know, the Marxist Hegelians are the right ones. The right Hegelians are the right ones. Well, you don't have to think about Hegel anymore. Congratulations. You're done, right? But then you don't think about Hegel anymore. Because you know what the funny thing about thinking is? Thinking is in the business of not thinking. Why do you think about something? So you can stop thinking about it. Like, so it's kind of funny. So you have, we were talking about consciousness as for itself, but consciousness almost seems like it always, so if we use that term consciousness or mind or spirit, that's a controversy too. People debate what phenomenology of spirit should be translated into. It should be spirit, blah, blah, blah. But let's just use consciousness. Well, it's kind of funny because it's almost like consciousness has to exist in a constant battle with brain. And I like to say the brain is the frenemy. So your brain is pretty biological. Your brain does not want to use energy. So yeah, it's going to think, but it wants to think so it can rest, right? So like it wants to determine the right interpretation of Hegel so it can sit down and be done and just be like, I know Hegel. And it feels so good to say, I know Hegel. Man, I'm a Hegel scout. Man, I know Hegel. Your brain loves that stuff because now you get to rest. Now you get like status. Now you stroke your ego and now you can like power dominate over other people. Man, your brain loves that stuff. But then that consciousness of yours that you trained with Hegel went, hey, brain, hey, you're not gaining more self-consciousness. You stop moving. You're not developing. Consciousness is supposed to be forced. So your consciousness is like tapping on your brain. It's like, hey, I'm for myself and you're getting in the way. So now we're at odds. You need to overcome that tendency, brain, of seeking to rest and whatever, and get an understanding of reality that doesn't give you excuses to feel like you're rational and intellectual when you stop thinking. So one of that's as a note, that's another great thing about Hegel is it teaches you that your natural tendency to seek a resolution is problematic and is actually probably anti-self-consciousness. And it actually kind of sets you up to see a sort of dialectic between your brain and consciousness, if you will. Someone like Seth Godin talks about the lizard brain, or, where your brain is kind of very biological. So, but it's kind of funny because your brain is, your consciousness is stuck dealing with your brain because it seems to have, we can get into the mind-body problem or whatever. I don't think we have to, but there's actually something, there's like a dialectic right here between the consciousness that wants to be for itself and the consciousness and the brain that just wants to be done, Frank. It just wants to be done. So there's actually a paradox right there, right? And there's actually a kind of AB where consciousness equals brain, but doesn't equal brain, or is like left hemisphere, right? You can get to the Ian Gilchrist and things that matter and so on. So there's something very interesting. One of the things, so Hegel wants to really focus on paradox and contradiction because that's going to continue thinking. And also, if we understand the absolute as something of which the very subjectivity or subject of which is seeking it, therefore, in a way, is changed by that absolute, and the absolute itself changes in its nature and it becomes a feedback loop, then by definition, you must always be thinking because the thinking is the changing, if you will. So a strategy of the brain to find rest must be in favor of what I like to call the truth, Hegel, Wittgenstein's everything that is the case, but not in favor of the absolute, which I like to say is everything that is the case, plus plus you reconstituting it, plus you changing it and so on. That little spot where the map isn't the territory, where the break between the map and the territory is unveiled. That's what you have to understand is there. And the emphasis on that I think Todd is emphasizing, the emphasis on contradiction, I think is an important thing to focus on, because what is a contradiction? I like to call it a pure thought. A contradiction, by definition, cannot exist in the world, right? There cannot be a contradiction in reality. If contradiction, it's a pure thought, right? That's kind of weird. So your brain is able to think something that doesn't have any signified, any material representation in the world. You're able to think a pure thought. That's kind of crazy. What kind of creature must we be to be able to think a pure thought, to be able to think a contradiction. To, for example, you're able to go down the road and you mistake a dog for a cat. You think you saw a dog, but actually you saw a cat. How are you able to make a mistake? If everything is like, how is your brain able to make a mistake, right? And to genuinely think that in that moment, the dog equaled the cat, right? So it has ontological implications, because if you are able to think a contradiction, which does not exist in the world, it can only be a pure idea, to use that term,
right.
Then we have to somehow be a kind of being that can think a pure idea. Mm-hmm. And so that has ontological significance. Mm-hmm. Because I think, I try in the Truths of the Rational, Michelle and I, we try to talk about how basically epistemology and ontology are always linked. Like they're always linked together. If you're able to think or use mental models, that says something about the kind of being you are. Mm-hmm. And so if we take seriously the fact that we're able to think things that cannot be materially represented in the world, then that means we are able to think pure thoughts. And that has ontological implications. And that means consciousness also is able to consider the world in ways that seems different from how the brain just takes in things. And therefore there is a kind of division. And therefore there is a kind of dialectic. So, and then I'll pass it back to you. The taking seriously the contradiction and the paradox, as opposed to, here's the thing, this is what we tend to do. We say that's a contradiction, therefore it's effaced. It doesn't matter. And you kind of push it aside, right? You say it doesn't matter. Okay, well, even if the contradiction itself effaces, you still had the idea of the contradiction. And so it is still a phenomenon that you need to take account for because your consciousness is able to consider it. So it is still relevant for understanding your ontological structure, even if the contradiction to itself was effaced. And then before I go on, so if you take that seriously, where then you are ontologically capable of pure thought, then in order to get, then we don't as human beings tend to find meaning in direction unless what we are is somehow matched, like what we think we should do with our life. If it does not somehow match with what we are, then there is a disconnect that will make it very difficult to find meaning and direction. So, you can't figure out where you want to go until you know where you are. And so figuring out if in fact, like what kind of being are we to think contradiction is going to be a very necessary step if one is to, solve the meaning crisis or define direction and meaning, things like that. And more can be said on, but that would be the first thing I would say.
Right. And I really like, it's just everywhere in those guys like McGowan, Zizek, all those guys, and Cadell as well, emphasizing that these epistemological contradictions, they say something about being. And actually, this is how McGowan at least talks about a Hegelian critique of Spinoza, who has this idea of a pure, unchanging God, right? Self-identical substance. But the very fact that we can think, right? And then he has this idea of the intellectual contemplation of God, but the very idea of having that contemplation because of what it means to be a thinking being, that refutes his notion of a pure self-identical substance. You have to have a rupture in that substance in order for us to have thought itself. And but the thing is, it's not merely that. The fact that we can make an error, in my opinion, from my understanding, that also means the fact that we have error means that we also have the possibility for truth, and that without the possibility for error, there is no possibility for truth. And I was reading this essay by Georges Bataille on Hegel. It's called Hegel, Death and Sacrifice, and I'm quoting it in McGowan. My videos on McGowan's book. He talks about how you have the fly in a swarm, and the fact is, without the understanding, which is the Hegelian term for the capacity to divide yourself from the world and divide the world into entities. Without the understanding, there is no distinction between the flies, right? Because the flies, that distinction doesn't actually exist in the natural world. Distinction is not a category of the natural world. And actually, I've been, Graham Harman and object-oriented ontology. Yes. So he has this idea of universalizing the Kantian gap of subject and object. And he just says, well, why don't we just say all objects are barred from each other. And my problem with that, and I'm not sure if this critique has been made, my problem with that is that he is supposedly being anti anthropocentric, anthropomorphic,
Yeah,
I don't
making
know,
it. Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
but the fact is, in order to have this idea of distinct objects in the world, you already need the understanding. So what he's doing is, in fact, he's universalizing the understanding in the natural world. And I don't think Hegel does. Well, Hegel doesn't do that. He shows how really without the understanding, you don't have the separate entities, and really you don't even have truth, because even though error comes into the world with consciousness, that is also the possibility of truth. And that's really what Hegel is getting at. And that would be his critique of Kant, who, when he stops at the understanding and doesn't go into reason, because reason is what thinks through contradictions. And of course, there's the Kantian antinomies. For Hegel, that's not an issue. That's just proof of reason's power to think through these contradictions